I'm Geraldine Moore, 72, and 6 months ago I lost my husband Brian, a brilliant aerospace engineer who died saving his crew during a critical mission failure. His family made it clear I wasn't welcome at his memorial service, calling me just the old woman who trapped him in his final years. They saw me as the gold digger who stole their golden boy. But when NASA's director personally called me Mrs. Hero Astronaut and revealed the truth about Brian's final moments and what he'd hidden from everyone, including me, realized his family's cruelty was about to backfire in ways they never imagined. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever felt excluded from grief that was rightfully yours, like this video, the memorial program felt heavy in my trembling hands, heavier than it should have been for such a simple folded paper. Brian's name was printed in elegant script across the front, but as I opened it, my heart sank. There, listed under surviving family members, were his sister Margaret, his brother David, his parents, even distant cousins I'd never met. My name was nowhere to be found. I sat in the back row of the chapel, clutching Brian's wedding ring on the chain around my neck. The funeral director had approached me awkwardly that morning, explaining that the family had requested I sit separately from the immediate family section. The words stung, but I held my composure. This was about honoring Brian, not about me. Margaret stood at the podium, her silver hair perfectly styled, her black dress expensive and tailored. She spoke about Brian's childhood, his achievements, his dedication to his work. She mentioned his brief marriage only once, her voice taking on a particular tone when she said, "It as if it were an unfortunate mistake rather than the 5 happiest years of his life." Brian was always generous with his affections, Margaret continued, her eyes finding mine across the crowded chapel. Sometimes too generous. But family was what mattered most to him. Family was his true legacy. The implication was clear. I was not family. I was not his legacy. I was simply a temporary inconvenience that had lasted longer than expected. When the service ended, people approached me with genuine sympathy. Brian's NASA colleagues, neighbors who had known us as a couple, friends from our community center, where we'd met, they saw me as his widow, his wife, his partner. But Margaret positioned herself like a guard, intercepting conversations, steering people away from me with subtle social maneuvering. "Thank you for coming," she would say to Brian's co-workers, then add, quietly, "The family is receiving visitors at the house later." The family, not me. I watched from across the room as she held court near Brian's photo, a picture I'd never seen before. One that must have been taken years before we met. In it, he looked younger, more serious, surrounded by his siblings at some family gathering. It was as if our life together had never existed. The final humiliation came when David approached me, his face a mask of polite concern. "Geraldine, we appreciate you coming today. Brian would have wanted you here. But you understand, the family needs private time to grieve. The reception is just for close family." Close family. After 5 years of marriage, after being the one who held Brian's hand through his father's illness, after being the one who celebrated his promotions and comforted him through his doubts. I was not close family. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. I gathered my purse, still clutching that memorial program with its glaring omission, and walked out into the afternoon sun. Behind me, I could hear Margaret's voice, bright and social, welcoming the real mourners to continue the celebration of Brian's life. A celebration I was not invited to attend. Our marriage certificate hangs in a simple frame on the kitchen wall, or hung, I should say, until Margaret's lawyer demanded to see it as evidence of suspicious circumstances. The irony wasn't lost on me that the document proving our legal union was being used to question its validity. I met Brian at the Riverside Community Center on a Tuesday evening in March, 5 years ago. I was there for the Widows Support Group. My first husband had passed 3 years earlier, and Brian was setting up chairs for the veterans meeting that followed ours. He was methodical, precise, making sure each chair was perfectly aligned. When he noticed me watching, he smiled sheepishly. "Occupational hazard," he said, adjusting one more chair. "NASA doesn't tolerate crooked anything." We talked for 20 minutes that evening. 20 minutes that changed both our lives. He told me about his work, his pride in contributing to space exploration, his loneliness since his divorce 15 years earlier. I told him about my late husband, my grown children who lived across the country, my quiet life that felt too quiet sometimes. "Would you like to get coffee sometime?" he asked as I gathered my purse. "I mean, if that's not too forward, I haven't asked anyone out in a very long time." Our first date was at a diner downtown. We talked for 3 hours, until the waitress started stacking chairs around us. Brian was nothing like my first husband where Paul had been, boisterous and social. Brian was thoughtful and introspective. Where Paul had made quick decisions, Brian considered every angle. But they both had the same kindness, the same genuine interest in making me happy. The age difference, he was 57, I was 72, ever seemed to matter to either of us. We were both at stages in our lives where we'd learned what was important and what wasn't. We valued quiet evenings, meaningful conversations, the simple pleasure of sharing a meal with someone who understood you. 6 months later, he proposed, not with fanfare or grand gestures, but on a quiet Sunday morning, as we read the newspaper together. "Geraldine," he said, looking up from the science section, "I know we haven't known each other very long, but I can't imagine my life without you now. Would you marry me?" I said yes before he even finished the question. The wedding was small, just us, 2 witnesses from the community center, and a judge who seemed charmed by our late-in-life romance. I wore a simple blue dress. Brian wore his best suit. We exchanged vows we'd written ourselves, promising to cherish whatever time we had together. Brian's family didn't attend. They'd made their disapproval clear from the moment he introduced me. Margaret had actually laughed when he first mentioned me, assuming I was joking. When she realized I was real, the laughter stopped. "You're making a mistake," she told him, during one particularly uncomfortable family dinner. "She's obviously after your money. A woman her age doesn't marry for love." But Brian never wavered. He defended me quietly but firmly, setting boundaries with his family that he'd never established before. "Geraldine is my wife," he would say simply. "If you can't respect that, then we have nothing to discuss." The hardest part was watching him lose his family's approval. He'd been the favored child, the successful one, the one who brought pride to the family name. But he chose me over their acceptance, and I knew it cost him more than he ever let on. Our marriage was peaceful, comfortable, filled with small joys. We traveled nothing exotic, just weekend trips to places we'd never seen. We gardened together, turning our small backyard into something beautiful. We read books and discussed them, watched old movies, cooked meals together. "I never thought I'd be this happy again," he told me on our 4th anniversary. "I thought I was too old for this kind of love." I felt the same way. At 72, I'd found a love that was different from my first marriage, deeper, more appreciative, more aware of how precious and fragile happiness could be. The NASA incident report arrived 3 weeks after the funeral. A stark, clinical document that reduced Brian's death to bullet points and technical specifications. I read it in the kitchen where his coffee cup still sat on the counter. Unwashed, a small rebellion against the finality of loss. Catastrophic engine failure during pre-flight testing of the Artemis VII spacecraft. The report began. 3 fatalities. Brian Moore, Senior Systems Engineer; Captain Maria Santos, Test Pilot; Lieutenant James Chen, Flight Engineer. That Tuesday morning had started like any other. Brian kissed me goodbye at 6:30 a.m., coffee cup in hand, lunch I'd packed tucked under his arm. He was excited about the test. They were so close to clearing the spacecraft for its first manned mission to establish a lunar research station. "This could be the one, Gary," he'd said, using the nickname only he was allowed to use. "If today goes well, we'll have taken another giant step toward permanent human presence on the moon." He called me around noon, which was unusual. Brian respected my Tuesday book club and rarely interrupted, but his voice carried an energy I hadn't heard in months. "The preliminary checks are perfect," he said. "Maria's confident. The systems are responding beautifully. I know I'm not supposed to say this, but I think we're going to make history today." Those were the last words I heard from him. The explosion happened at 3:47 p.m., during what should have been a routine engine test. According to the report, a fuel line coupling failed, causing a cascade of system failures that led to complete engine detonation. The spacecraft was destroyed instantly. The 3 crew members in the testing chamber didn't survive. But those clinical details didn't capture what I learned later from Tom Rodriguez, Brian's project partner, who called me that evening. Tom's voice was shaky, barely controlled. Geraldine, I need you to know what Brian did in those final moments. He paused, collecting himself. The emergency protocols failed. The automatic systems didn't engage. Brian had seconds to manually override the safety systems, and he did it. He saved the entire complex. If that explosion had spread to the main fuel depot, Tom's voice broke. There were 200 people in that building. Brian's actions contained the blast to just the testing chamber. He knew what it would cost him, but he did it anyway. The official report mentioned none of this. It listed equipment failure as the cause, noting that all safety protocols were followed and that the incident was contained to the testing area due to proper facility design. Proper facility design. Not Brian's split-second decision to stay at his post and manually isolate the fuel systems while the chamber filled with fire and smoke. Not his choice to sacrifice himself to save his colleagues. Not his final act of heroism that prevented a catastrophe that would have made national headlines. I called Tom back the next day, needing to understand more. Why isn't this in the report? I asked. Politics, he said bitterly. NASA's already under budget pressure. The last thing they want is a report that suggests their safety systems failed and only human intervention prevented a disaster. Much cleaner to call it equipment failure and move on. But Brian, people should know what he did. I know, Geraldine, and some of us are working on that, but it takes time. There are proper channels, investigations, committees. The truth will come out eventually. Eventually. Such a vague promise when you're sitting in a kitchen that still smells like your husband's coffee, holding an official document that reduces his heroism to a footnote about proper facility design. I folded the report and placed it in the drawer, with all the other papers that had invaded my life since Brian's death: insurance forms, legal documents, official notifications. Somewhere in that bureaucratic maze was the truth about my husband's final moments. But it was buried under layers of official language and institutional caution. That night, I lay in our bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how many other heroes had been quietly erased from official records in the name of avoiding inconvenient truths. The family photograph sits on Margaret's mantella, professional portrait taken at some resort years before I met Brian. In it, the Moore family looks like something from a magazine spread. Margaret in elegant pearls, David in a perfectly pressed shirt, their parents dignified and proud, and Brian, younger and more formal than I ever knew him, standing slightly apart from the group. I'd seen this photo once, during the only family gathering Brian had convinced me to attend. It was our second year of marriage, and he'd thought enough time had passed for his family to accept me. He was wrong. Margaret had dominated that dinner from the moment we arrived. At 65, she carried herself with the authority of someone who'd never been contradicted. As the eldest child and only daughter, she'd appointed herself the family's guardian, managing their parents' affairs, organizing gatherings, and maintaining what she called family standards. Geraldine, she'd said that evening, her smile sharp as glass, how interesting that you've chosen to marry again, at your age. Most women your age are focused on their grandchildren. The comment stung because it was partially true. My own children lived across the country, busy with their own lives. I saw my grandchildren twice a year, if I was lucky. But Margaret's tone suggested this was a failing, not a circumstance. Brian's brother David was quieter but no less disapproving. A successful attorney, he approached our marriage like a legal problem to be solved. During that same dinner, he'd casually mentioned prenuptial agreements and estate planning. His questions seemingly innocent, but clearly designed to determine my financial motivations. Brian's been so generous with his retirement planning, David had said, swirling his wine. I hope you're encouraging him to think about long-term security. For both of you, of course. What they didn't understand or chose not to understand was that Brian and I had discussed finances openly from the beginning. I had my own modest savings, my own home, my own life. I wasn't looking for security. I was looking for companionship. But to the Moore family, a 72-year-old woman marrying their 57-year-old brother could only be explained by greed. The family's wealth complicated everything. Brian's grandfather had made a fortune in real estate, and the family had maintained their social standing through careful marriages and strategic investments. Brian's NASA salary was substantial, but more importantly, he stood to inherit a significant portion of the family estate. As the only son who'd achieved professional success, Margaret controlled the family trust, a responsibility she took seriously. She'd married well herself, her husband owned a chain of medical equipment companies, and she viewed family wealth as something to be protected from outsiders. In her mind, I was the ultimate outsider, too old, too working class, too obviously different from the women the more men usually married. "You have to understand," Brian had told me after that disastrous dinner, "Margaret's always been protective of the family. She means well, but she has very specific ideas about how things should be." I'd nodded, but privately I wondered if Brian was being naive. Margaret's protection felt more like control, and her specific ideas seemed to exclude anyone who didn't fit her vision of appropriate family members. The most painful part was watching Brian navigate between his family's expectations and his love for me. He'd been their golden child, the brilliant engineer who'd made them proud, the successful son who'd validated their investment in his education. But choosing me had somehow tarnished that golden image. "He's having a midlife crisis," I'd overheard Margaret tell David during that same dinner. "Men his age make foolish decisions. We just have to wait it out." As if our marriage was a temporary inconvenience that would resolve itself given time. As if my love for Brian was somehow less real because of when it had begun. But Brian never wavered. He'd made his choice, and he stood by it even when it cost him his family's approval. That loyalty meant everything to me, but I also knew it isolated him from the people who'd been his support system his entire life. Looking back now, I realized Margaret's hostility wasn't just about protecting family wealth, it was about protecting family narrative. The Moore family had a specific story about themselves: successful, respectable, traditional. My presence disrupted that story, challenged their assumptions about appropriate relationships and family dynamics. They couldn't simply dislike me. They had to delegitimize me entirely. Only by casting me as an outsider, a temporary fixture, a woman with ulterior motives, could they maintain their comfortable beliefs about their family and their brother's judgment. The sympathy cards arrived in waves during the first 2 weeks after the funeral, stacking up on my kitchen table like paper monuments to loss. Cards from Brian's NASA colleagues, neighbors who'd known us as a couple, members of our community center, even strangers who'd read about the accident in the newspaper. Each one acknowledged me as Brian's wife, his widow, his surviving partner. None came from his family. I read each card carefully, treasuring the handwritten notes that shared memories of Brian I'd never heard. "He always talked about you with such pride," wrote Dr. Sarah Kim from his research team. "We all knew how much he loved you." Another colleague, Marcus Webb, wrote, "Brian lit up whenever he mentioned Geraldine Moore. Made him happier than I'd ever seen him." These words were lifelines during the darkest weeks, proof that our marriage had been real and recognized by the people who knew Brian best. But they also highlighted the cruel irony of my situation. Everyone except his family could see how much we'd meant to each other. The practical challenges mounted quickly. Without family support, I had to navigate the bureaucratic maze of death alone. Social Security survivor benefits, life insurance claims, NASA pension paperwork, each form requiring documentation of our marriage, each office visit a reminder of my official status as Brian's widow and my unofficial status as his family's unwanted problem. The financial pressure was immediate and crushing. Brian had always handled our money, and while I knew we were comfortable, I hadn't realized how much of that comfort depended on his NASA salary. The mortgage payment loomed, utilities continued regardless of grief, and the legal fees from Margaret's challenge to the will were mounting faster than I could calculate. Mrs. Patterson from next door became my unexpected savior during those first weeks. She'd bring casseroles and stay to chat, treating me exactly as she always had as Brian's wife, as half of the couple she'd known and liked. Her normalcy was a gift when everything else felt surreal. "That family of his should be ashamed," she said one afternoon, unpacking groceries she'd bought for me without being asked. Brian was lucky to find love again, and they're too stubborn to see it. The phone calls were the hardest part. Well-meaning friends would ask how the family was treating me, assuming that shared grief would bridge old conflicts. I learned to deflect these questions, unwilling to admit the depth of my isolation. "Everyone grieves differently," I'd say, which was technically true even if it obscured the reality that Brian's family was grieving his choice of wife as much as his death. Sleep became elusive. I'd wake at 3 a.m. to an empty house that still smelled like Brian's aftershave, still echoed with memories of our conversations. During the day, I moved through our routines, mechanically making coffee for one, reading the newspaper alone, tending the garden we'd planted together. The silence was overwhelming. Brian and I had been talkers, filling our evenings with discussions about his work, my books, the small events that made up our shared life. Now the house felt cavernous, every room too quiet, every surface a reminder of partnership lost. Tom Rodriguez called weekly to check on me, updating me on the ongoing investigation into the accident. His kindness felt like charity sometimes, but I was grateful for any connection to Brian's professional world. The team misses him, Tom would say, and we all think what his family's doing is wrong. Brian would be furious if he knew how they're treating you. That thought sustained me during the darkest moments. The certainty that Brian would have fought for me, would have been outraged by his family's cruelty. But it also deepened my loneliness, knowing that the one person who could have defended me was gone. Brian's will was a masterpiece of protective planning, and I discovered this only when Margaret's lawyer demanded I produce it for examination. The document sat in my attorney's office like a shield Brian had crafted from beyond the grave, every clause carefully constructed to withstand exactly the challenge his family was mounting. "Mrs. Moore," said my attorney, Janet Collins, sliding the will across her desk, "your husband was remarkably thorough. This isn't just a will, it's a fortress." I read Brian's words through tears that made the legal language blur. "To my beloved wife, Geraldine Moore, I leave all my worldly possessions, knowing that she will honor my memory and use these resources to live the life we planned together. My family may question this decision, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life." Margaret's challenge came through her attorney, Harrison Blackwell, a man whose expensive suit and cold demeanor announced his purpose before he spoke. He arrived at Jeanette's office with a briefcase full of accusations and implications, each one designed to paint me as a manipulative woman who'd exploited Brian's loneliness. Mrs. Moore was significantly older than the decedent, Blackwell argued, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to winning. The marriage occurred after a brief courtship, and the decedent was isolated from his family during the relationship. These are classic indicators of undue influence. Janet's response was swift and devastating. "Mr. Blackwell, your client's brother was a 57-year-old aerospace engineer with a doctorate from MIT. Not a confused elderly man susceptible to manipulation. Are you seriously arguing that a brilliant scientist couldn't make informed decisions about his personal life?" The will itself dismantled every argument Margaret's team could construct. Brian had included detailed explanations for his decisions, references to previous conversations with attorneys, and specific acknowledgments of his family's disapproval. He'd even anticipated the undue influence claim. "I am of sound mind and clear judgment," the document stated. "My family's objections to my marriage stem from their own prejudices, not from any failing in my wife's character. Geraldine has brought me happiness I thought I'd lost forever, and she deserves to be provided for after my death." But the most devastating section came near the end. "Should my family contest this will or attempt to interfere with my wife's inheritance, I direct that detailed documentation of their behavior toward Geraldine be made available to the court. Their treatment of my wife has been unconscionable, and any legal challenge will only prove their continued cruelty." Blackwell's confidence wavered as Janet produced Brian's documentation, copies of hostile emails from Margaret, recordings of telephone conversations where David questioned my motives, even photographs from family gatherings where I'd been deliberately excluded or humiliated. "Your client may not realize it," Janet told Blackwell, "but her brother was a careful man. He documented everything, anticipating exactly this scenario." The most damaging evidence was a letter Brian had written to his family 18 months before his death, copies of which he'd kept in his personal files. In it, he'd explicitly warned them about their treatment of me and threatened to cut contact if it continued. "Geraldine is my wife," the letter stated firmly. "She will be my widow if I predecise her, and she deserves your respect in both capacities. Your continued hostility forces me to choose between my family of birth and my family of choice. If that choice becomes necessary, I will choose the person who loves me without conditions." Margaret had never responded to that letter, assuming Brian's threats were empty. Now, reading it in a lawyer's office, she realized how seriously he'd taken their behavior and how carefully he'd prepared for their inevitable challenge. The financial implications were staggering. Brian's estate was worth more than I'd realized his NASA pension, life insurance, investments, and his share of the family trust totaled nearly $2 million. Margaret wasn't just challenging a will, she was fighting for a fortune. This isn't about money, she insisted during one particularly heated meeting. This is about protecting Brian's legacy from someone who never understood our family. Your brother's legacy, Janet replied coldly, was his choice to love my client. Everything else is commentary. The legal fees were mounting for both sides, but Margaret had deeper pockets and seemed willing to spend whatever was necessary. She hired additional attorneys, investigators, even a psychologist, to evaluate Brian's mental state during our marriage. Each move cost money I didn't have, and emotional energy I was running out of. But Brian's will held firm. Every challenge revealed new layers of his planning, new evidence of his determination to protect me from his family's interference. He'd loved me enough to wage a legal war from beyond the grave. Brian's journal was hidden in the back of his closet, behind a box of old NASA manuals I'd never had reason to move. I found it while packing his clothes for donation, a task I'd been avoiding for weeks but could no longer postpone. The leather-bound book fell open as I lifted it, revealing Brian's precise handwriting, and the first entry that would change everything I thought I knew about our marriage. March 15th. Met the most remarkable woman today at the community center, Geraldine. She has this way of listening that makes you feel heard, really heard. I haven't felt that in years. Margaret would hate her immediately. She's too real, too genuine for my family's taste. But I think I'm falling in love. I sat on our bedroom floor, surrounded by boxers of Brian's belongings, and read 5 years of his most private thoughts. The journal revealed a man I'd known but never fully understood. Someone who'd been acutely aware of his family's flaws and fiercely protective of our relationship from the very beginning. April 3rd, Geraldine said yes. I haven't been this happy since I was a child. Called Margaret to share the news, and her silence said everything. She tried to sabotage this. She can't stand that I've found happiness outside her control. I need to be smarter this time, more careful. Geraldine deserves protection from my family's poison. Entry after entry revealed Brian's growing awareness of his family's hostility and his methodical planning to shield me from it. He'd documented every slight, every cruel comment, every attempt to undermine our marriage. But more than that, he'd strategized ways to protect me that I'd never known about. June 20th, David brought up the prenup again today. Told him, absolutely not. If something happens to me, Geraldine should be provided for completely. She's given me more love in 2 years than my family has given me in 57 years. Margaret thinks I'm being foolish, but she doesn't understand what real love looks like. The journal revealed the depth of planning behind his will, his legal preparations, even his decision to document our conversations with his family. Brian hadn't been naive about their behavior, he'd been strategic. September 12th, Margaret's dinner party was torture, as expected. Watched her ignore Geraldine all evening, seat her away from family conversation, treat her like hired help. Geraldine handled it with more grace than they deserved. Made my decision final today. If they can't respect my wife, they don't deserve my presence. But the most heartbreaking entries dealt with his internal struggle between family loyalty and protecting me. Brian had loved his family despite their flaws, and cutting contact with them had caused him genuine pain. November 8th. Haven't spoken to Margaret in 3 weeks since the Thanksgiving invitation debacle. She invited me, but specifically excluded Geraldine again. I'm tired of this game. Either they accept my wife, or they don't have a brother. Simple as that. Geraldine thinks I should reconcile, but she doesn't understand how toxic they can be. Reading his private thoughts about me was overwhelming. I'd known he loved me, but seeing it written in his own hand, reading his daily appreciation for our life together, made his loss feel fresh all over again. December 25th, Christmas morning with Geraldine. We made pancakes and opened presents and read the newspaper together. This is what happiness looks like: simple, quiet, real. My family spent their Christmas at some expensive resort, posting pictures on social media to show how successful and sophisticated they are. I choose this life, this woman, this genuine love over their performance any day. The later entries grew more practical as Brian's health concerns prompted him to plan for my future more carefully. Heart palpitations he'd never mentioned to me had scared him into action. March 10th, doctor says the irregular heartbeat is probably nothing, but it reminded me how fragile life is. Spent today updating my will, adding more protections for Geraldine. If my family tries to hurt her after I'm gone, they'll find themselves fighting a battle I've already planned for them to lose. The final entry was dated just 2 weeks before his death, and it broke my heart completely. May 30th. Geraldine was humming while she gardened today, and I realized I've never been this content. If something happens to me tomorrow, I want her to know that these 5 years have been the best of my life. She saved me from becoming like my family, bitter, controlling, afraid of genuine emotion. Whatever time we have left, it's a gift. Closed the journal and wept for Brian's loneliness before we met, for his pain at losing his family's approval, for his determination to protect me even from beyond the grave. But mostly I wept with gratitude for a love that had been even deeper and more thoughtful than I'd realized. Brian hadn't just loved me, he'd studied how to love me better. He'd anticipated challenges I'd never considered and prepared solutions I'd never needed to know about. His journal was proof that our marriage had been the center of his world, not the mistake his family claimed it to be. The call from NASA came on a Thursday morning in July, exactly 3 months after the memorial service that had excluded me so cruelly. I was in the garden, tending the tomatoes Brian and I had planted together, when the phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Mrs. Moore. This is Director Patricia Hawkins from NASA headquarters. I'm calling regarding the investigation into your husband's accident. My hands were still dirty from the soil as I fumbled with the phone. NASA had been investigating for months, but no one had contacted me directly. The official reports came through intermediaries, clinical documents that reduced Brian's heroism to technical specifications. Mrs. Moore, I need to ask you some questions about the days leading up to the accident. Would you be available to meet with our investigative team? The meeting was scheduled for the following week at the Johnson Space Center, a place I'd visited only once before, when Brian had proudly shown me his workspace. Walking through those halls without him felt like entering a shrine to everything I'd lost. Director Hawkins was a woman in her 50s, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. She met me in a conference room where a mission video footage was queued up on a large screen, the timestamp showing the moments before Brian's death. Mrs. Moore, what I'm about to show you is classified information that's been cleared for next of kin viewing only. Your husband's family has requested that we share this information with his sister Margaret as the primary family contact. I'm his wife, I said quietly. I'm his next of kin. Director Hawkins paused, consulting a folder. Yes, of course. I apologize. There's been some confusion about family notification procedures. Some parties have been claiming that your marriage was. She stopped herself. Let me be clear, you are legally Brian's next of kin, and you have the right to this information. The video began with routine mission footage, Brian and his team conducting pre-flight checks, their voices calm and professional over the intercom. I watched my husband alive and focused, doing the work he loved, unaware that he had minutes left to live. Then everything changed. Warning lights began flashing, alarms sounded, and I could hear the tension escalate in the control room. Brian's voice came through clearly, calm, despite the chaos around him. Engine pressure dropping rapidly, fuel line integrity compromised, initiating emergency shutdown sequence. Director Hawkins paused the video. This is where the automatic safety systems should have engaged. They didn't. The backup systems failed. Your husband was faced with a choice: evacuate immediately and let the explosion spread to the main fuel depot, or stay and manually contain the blast. The video resumed. I watched Brian's hands move across his control panel with practiced precision, his voice steady as he coordinated with his team, but I could also see him glancing toward the emergency exit, calculating distances, making the decision that would save lives and cost him his own. Manual override initiated. Brian's voice came through the speakers, isolating fuel systems. Maria James, you need to evacuate now. What about you? Came Captain Santos's voice. Someone has to maintain the containment sequence. Go now. Director Hawkins stopped the video again. Your husband stayed at his post for another 90 seconds, manually controlling systems that should have been automated. He saved 200 lives that day. Mrs. Moore, the explosion was contained to a single testing chamber instead of spreading throughout the complex. I watched those final 90 seconds in silence, seeing Brian work with methodical determination, even as smoke began filling the chamber. He knew what was coming. I could see it in his movements, the way he checked procedures one final time, the way he braced himself. His last words, barely audible over the alarms, were "Tell Geraldine, I love her." The screen went black as the explosion occurred. I sat in the silent conference room, overwhelmed by the heroism of Brian's final moments and the cruelty of his family's attempt to exclude me from even knowing about them. "Mrs. Moore," Director Hawkins said gently, "there's more you need to understand. Some people within NASA wanted to classify this incident to avoid questions about our safety systems. Your husband's sacrifice has been downplayed in official reports to protect institutional interests. That's why I wasn't contacted directly. Partly, yes, and partly because your husband's sister has been very persistent in her communications with us. She suggested that as the eldest family member, she should be the primary contact for all matters related to Brian's legacy. I thought of Margaret's cold efficiency, her need to control every aspect of Brian's memory. Even in death, she was trying to manage his story, to shape his legacy according to her vision of appropriate family narrative." "What happens now?" I asked. Director Hawkins leaned forward. "That depends partly on you, Mrs. Moore. There are people here who believe your husband's heroism deserves recognition, real recognition, not just a classified file. But that process would require family support, and until now, we weren't certain about family dynamics. You have my support," I said without hesitation. "Brian deserves to be honored for what he really did, even if it means challenging the current narrative. Even if it means a very public recognition that might upset certain family members." I thought of Brian's journal, his documented frustration with his family's treatment of me, his explicit desire to protect my status as his wife. I thought of Margaret's cruel exclusion from his memorial, her attempt to erase me from his story. "Director Hawkins, my husband chose to save lives instead of saving himself. If his family can't handle the truth about his heroism, that's their problem, not mine." Brian's final radio transmission existed in a secured NASA database, accessible only to investigators and family members with proper clearance. Director Hawkins handed me headphones in that sterile conference room, her expression solemn as she prepared me for what I was about to hear. "This is unedited audio from the final minutes," she explained. "Some family members have found it too difficult to listen to. If you need to stop at any point, I need to hear it," I interrupted. "I need to hear his voice." The audio began with routine communication, Brian coordinating with his team, running through standard procedures. His voice was calm, professional, the voice I'd heard discussing work challenges over dinner countless times. But as the crisis developed, I could hear subtle changes, a tightening in his tone, words spoken more precisely, the controlled urgency of someone managing a catastrophe. "Control, this is Moore. We have multiple system failures. Fuel line rupture confirmed. Automatic containment is not responding." The background noise, escalated alarms, shouting voices, the sound of people moving quickly. Through it all, Brian's voice remained steady, an anchor of calm in the chaos. "Maria, James, you need to evacuate the chamber immediately. I'm initiating manual override of the fuel isolation system." "Brian, get out of there," came Captain Santos's voice, high with fear. "Negative. Someone has to maintain containment. If this spreads to the main depot, we lose the entire complex. 200 people work in this building." I could hear him working, the click of switches, the hum of machinery. His breathing slightly labored as smoke began affecting the chamber's air quality, but his voice never wavered. "Control, manual isolation is holding, but barely. Fuel pressure is still climbing. I need emergency response teams standing by." Director Hawkins paused the audio. "At this point, Mrs. Moore, your husband had approximately 2 minutes to evacuate safely. He chose to stay." The next section was the hardest to hear. Brian's breathing became more difficult as the chamber filled with smoke, but his hands never stopped working. I could hear him muttering calculations under his breath, checking procedures, fighting to maintain systems that were failing around him. "Control, isolation is stable, but I'm losing atmospheric integrity in here. If anyone needs to reach me, the next 60 seconds are the window." "Brian, please," came Tom Rodriguez's voice, tight with emotion. "You've done enough. Get out." "Negative, Tom. Too risky. The manual systems need constant adjustment. If I leave now." Brian's voice was interrupted by a coughing fit as the smoke thickened. When he spoke again, his words were slightly slurred but determined. "If I leave now, this whole section goes up." The final minute was almost unbearable. Brian's voice grew weaker, but his focus never wavered. He called out readings, confirmed system statuses, maintained the delicate balance that kept the explosion contained. Control, fuel pressure, stabilizing, containment holding. Emergency teams can approach safely in 30 seconds. Another coughing fit, longer this time. System is locked in safe mode. Should maintain integrity even if if I can't. Then, so quietly, I almost missed it. Tell Geraldine I love her. Tell her she made me brave enough for this. The explosion that followed lasted only seconds, but it felt eternal. When the audio cleared, there were only voices calling Brian's name, people realizing what he'd sacrificed to save them. I removed the headphones with shaking hands. Director Hawkins sat quietly, allowing me time to process what I'd heard. When I finally looked up, her eyes were filled with tears she was trying to hide. Mrs. Moore, your husband's actions that day prevented what could have been the worst disaster in NASA's history. The fuel depot contained enough material to level 6 city blocks. The loss of life would have been catastrophic. Why hasn't this been made public? Politics, insurance concerns, budget implications. If the public knew that our safety systems failed so completely, it would raise questions about other missions, other equipment. There are billions of dollars in contracts at stake, and Brian's heroism gets buried to protect contracts. Director Hawkins looked uncomfortable. The situation is more complex than that, budget, essentially. Some people believe institutional protection is more important than individual recognition. What do you believe? She was quiet for a long moment. I believe your husband died a hero, and heroes deserve to be honored. I also believe his widow deserves to know the truth about his final moments. The question is what we do with that truth. I've thought about Margaret's memorial service, where Brian had been remembered as a dedicated engineer but not as a man who'd saved hundreds of lives. I thought about the official reports that reduced his sacrifice to equipment failure contained by proper facility design. Director Hawkins, my husband spent his life working for NASA because he believed in the mission. He believed in pushing humanity forward, in taking risks for the greater good. His final act embodied everything he believed in. How can honoring that possibly hurt NASA? You're right, of course. The problem is convincing others in the bureaucracy. Change happens slowly in institutions this large. How slowly? Years, possibly, maybe decades. I thought of Brian's journal, his documented frustration with institutional politics, his desire to be remembered for his actual contributions rather than sanitized versions that made administrators comfortable. Director Hawkins, what if I told you I had evidence that my husband anticipated this exact scenario? What if he left specific instructions about how he wanted to be remembered? Her eyebrows rose. What kind of evidence? The kind that makes bureaucratic caution look exactly like what it is: cowardice in the face of truth. The threatening letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under my front door while I was having coffee in the kitchen. No postmark, no return address, just MY name, written in block letters across cheap white paper. Inside, the message was brief and chilling. Some widows know their place. Smart ones stay quiet. You should learn from their example. I called Janet Collins immediately, my hands trembling as I held the paper by its edges. She arrived within an hour, photographing the letter from multiple angles and bagging it like evidence in a crime scene. This escalates things significantly, she said, her professional calm not quite hiding her anger. Anonymous threats suggest someone is getting desperate. The timing wasn't coincidental. Word had somehow leaked about my meetings with NASA, about the classified information I'd been shown, about the possibility of Brian receiving posthumous recognition for his heroism. Margaret's legal challenge to the will was failing, her attempts to paint me as a gold digger crumbling under the weight of Brian's meticulous documentation. But rather than accepting defeat gracefully, the Moore family was doubling down on their campaign to discredit me. The social pressure intensified over the following weeks. Margaret had apparently been working her network of wealthy, connected friends, spreading carefully crafted stories about my manipulation of Brian. At the grocery store, I noticed whispered conversations that stopped when I approached. At the bank, the teller who'd known Brian and me as a couple now treated me with cool professionalism instead of friendly recognition. Mrs. Patterson warned me about strange cars parked on our street, people asking neighbors questions about my relationship with Brian, my financial situation, my background. Someone was conducting an investigation, trying to find ammunition for Margaret's crusade. It's harassment, Mrs. Patterson said indignantly, bringing me tea and sitting at my kitchen table like a protective friend. That woman is trying to destroy your reputation to justify her own cruelty. The financial pressure escalated as well. Margaret's attorney filed motions requesting detailed accounting of every penny Brian and I had spent during our marriage, demanding receipts for purchases, explanations for transfers between our accounts, proof that I hadn't somehow swindled money from Brian while he was alive. Each legal filing cost me money I didn't have, while Margaret's resources seemed unlimited. She could afford to drag this process out indefinitely, grinding me down with endless paperwork and mounting attorney fees. It was a war of attrition she was confident she could win. But the cruelest escalation came through David, who appeared at my door on a Friday evening with what he called a reasonable settlement offer. "Geraldine," he said, his lawyer's smile not reaching his eyes, "this legal battle is expensive for everyone. Margaret is prepared to be generous. Take $100,000, relinquish all claims to Brian's estate, and we can end this unpleasantness." Unpleasantness. The word felt bitter in my mouth. "Your family's treatment of me isn't unpleasantness, David. It's cruelty. You're being emotional. $100,000 is more than enough for a woman your age to live comfortably. Brian would want his family to be at peace. Brian wanted his wife to be provided for. He made that very clear in his will." David's facade slipped slightly. Brian wasn't thinking clearly those last few years. The marriage, the isolation from family, he wasn't himself. He was more himself with me than he'd ever been with you. "That's exactly what someone in your possession would say." David's voice hardened. "You isolated him from his real family, turned him against people who'd loved him his entire life. A judge might find that very interesting when considering claims of emotional manipulation." The threat was clear: take the settlement or face a protracted legal battle where they'd assassinate Brian's character along with mine. They were willing to destroy their own brother's reputation to avoid acknowledging his choice of wife. After David left, I sat in the living room Brian and I had shared, surrounded by the life we'd built together, and felt the weight of their campaign pressing down on me. They had money, connections, time, and a willingness to use all three to break me. What did I have? Then I remembered Director Hawkins's words about bureaucratic cowardice, about the choice between protecting institutional comfort and honoring truth. Margaret's family was making the same choice, protecting their comfortable narrative about appropriate family relationships, rather than accepting the reality of Brian's love for me. I thought about Brian's journal, his documented frustration with his family's behavior, his explicit desire to protect me from exactly this kind of attack. He'd known they would try to destroy me after his death, and he'd prepared for this battle, even if I hadn't. That night I called Director Hawkins at the emergency number she'd given me. "Mrs. Moore, is everything all right?" "Director Hawkins, you asked about evidence that Brian anticipated institutional cowardice. I'm ready to share it. But I need you to understand, this isn't just about NASA's recognition anymore. This is about stopping people who are willing to destroy a hero's memory to protect their own prejudices." "What kind of evidence are we talking about?" "The kind that makes it very clear what Brian thought about people who choose comfort over truth. The kind that explains exactly why he was brave enough to save 200 lives. Because he'd spent years learning to stand up to bullies, even when those bullies were his own family." The testimonial letter from Dr. Alina Vasquez arrived by email on a Thursday afternoon, marked urgent for legal proceedings. Alina had been Brian's research partner for 6 years, and her words carried the weight of professional observation and personal friendship. "To whom it may concern," the letter began, "I worked closely with Brian Moore from 2019 until his death in 2024. During that time, I witnessed his transformation from a competent but somewhat withdrawn colleague to a man energized by purpose and personal happiness. This transformation coincided directly with his marriage to Geraldine Moore." I printed the letter with shaking hands, reading each paragraph multiple times. Elena's testimony demolished Margaret's narrative about Brian's mental state during our marriage. Brian spoke frequently about his wife, always with obvious affection and pride. He would share stories about their gardening projects, their weekend trips, their quiet evenings reading together. Far from being isolated or manipulated, Brian appeared to have found exactly the partnership he'd been seeking his entire adult life. The letter detailed specific examples: how Brian had become more collaborative at work, more willing to mentor younger engineers, more optimistic about future projects. His marriage to Geraldine didn't diminish his professional capabilities, it enhanced them. He worked with renewed purpose, often stating that he wanted to make Geraldine proud of his contributions to the space program. Elena's letter was followed by others. Tom Rodriguez wrote a detailed account of Brian's discussions about his family's hostility toward me. Captain Sarah Kim described Brian's excitement when talking about our life together. Even Dr. Marcus Webb, the mission director, submitted a statement defending Brian's mental acuity and professional judgment throughout our marriage. The suggestion that Brian Moore was somehow compromised during his marriage is not only false, but insulting. Dr. Webb wrote, Brian was at the peak of his professional abilities, contributing to our most critical projects with wisdom and expertise that came partly from his personal contentment. His wife Geraldine was a source of strength, not a liability. But the most powerful support came from an unexpected source, Maria Santos, the pilot who'd been in the testing chamber with Brian when he died. She called me directly, her voice still carrying traces of the trauma from that day. Mrs. Moore, I need you to know what your husband did for us. Not just the technical stuff that's in the reports, but the human part. When everything went wrong, when we could have all panicked, Brian became this anchor of calm. And in those final seconds, when he could have run, he looked at us and said, My wife taught me that love means protecting people, even when it costs you everything. Cried hearing those words, imagining Brian thinking of our relationship even in his final moments, drawing strength from our love to make the choice that saved lives. Maria continued, There are people trying to say your marriage somehow weakened Brian, made him unstable or unreliable. That's not just wrong, it's the opposite of the truth. Your love made him stronger, more focused, more willing to sacrifice for others. If you hadn't been in his life, I don't think he would have had the emotional strength to do what he did. The professional testimonials were building into something Margaret couldn't ignore or dismiss. These weren't character references from friends, they were expert assessments from colleagues who'd worked with Brian daily, who'd observed his professional performance throughout our marriage, who could testify to his mental state and decision capabilities. Janet Collins was ecstatic when I forwarded her the collection of letters. Geraldine, this is exactly what we needed. Margaret's entire case rests on claiming Brian was somehow impaired during your marriage. These testimonials from his professional colleagues destroy that argument completely. But the letters did more than just provide legal ammunition. They gave me emotional validation I hadn't realized I desperately needed. For months, I'd been defending our marriage against accusations that it had been somehow fraudulent or harmful. Reading testimony from people who'd known Brian professionally, who'd seen how our relationship had actually affected him, proved that our love had been not only real but transformative. The NASA colleagues began reaching out directly, offering support that went beyond written testimonials. Dr. Vasquez invited me to lunch, where she shared stories about Brian. I'd never heard how he'd light up when talking about our weekend plans, how he'd brought me into conversations by sharing my opinions on books or current events, how obvious it was that I'd become the center of his world. Brian was a different person after he met you, Elena told me over coffee. Not different in a bad way, different in the way people are when they finally find where they belong. He'd spent years being professionally successful but personally isolated. You gave him the emotional security to be fully himself. Tom Rodriguez organized a gathering of Brian's closest colleagues, people who wanted to express their support for me and their outrage at his family's treatment. Sitting in that room, surrounded by people who'd known and respected Brian, I felt less alone than I had since his death. What Margaret is doing is wrong, Tom said bluntly. Brian chose you, supported you, prepared for exactly this scenario, because he knew his family might try this. We're not going to let them succeed. These allies were more than professional supporters, they were becoming friends. People who understood that honoring Brian's memory meant respecting his choices, including his choice to love me. Their support was changing the dynamics of Margaret's legal challenge and giving me the strength to fight back against her campaign of intimidation. But most importantly, they were helping me remember who Brian really was and why our marriage had mattered so much to him. In defending our relationship, they were preserving the truth about the man who died a hero. The call came at 7:23 a.m. on a Monday morning in September, 6 months after the memorial service where I'd been treated like an unwelcome stranger. I was making coffee in the kitchen Brian and I had shared, following the same routine we'd established over 5 years of marriage. when the phone rang with a Washington, D.C. area code. "Mrs. Moore, this is Director Patricia Hawkins from NASA headquarters. I'm calling with some important news regarding your husband's service record and our upcoming recognition ceremony." My hand trembled as I set down the coffee pot. "Recognition ceremony. Mrs. Moore, after extensive review of the incident reports and testimony from your husband's colleagues, NASA has decided to award Brian the Presidential Medal of Freedom posthumously. This is the highest civilian honor our nation can bestow, reserved for individuals whose actions have had profound impact on American interests and values." I sank into the kitchen chair where Brian used to read his morning technical journals, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Director Hawkins was telling me. "The ceremony will be held at the White House, with the President personally presenting the award to you as Brian's surviving spouse, Mrs. Moore. Your husband saved 200 lives that day and prevented what could have been the worst disaster in NASA's history. The American people deserve to know about his heroism." But the reports said equipment failure, contained by proper facility design. The reports were incomplete. "Mrs. Moore, the full truth is that your husband's individual actions, his decision to remain at his post and manually controlled systems that had failed, prevented a catastrophic explosion. Without his sacrifice, we would have lost not just the testing facility, but 6 surrounding buildings and everyone in them." Director Hawkins paused, and I could hear papers rustling. "Mrs. Moore, I need to tell you something else. During our investigation, we discovered that certain parties have been contacting NASA leadership, attempting to influence how we handle your husband's recognition. These parties have suggested that the agency should work through other family members rather than directly with you. Margaret, even in this moment of vindication, she was trying to control Brian's legacy, to position herself as the appropriate recipient of honors meant for his widow." Director Hawkins, "I am Brian's wife. I am his legal next of kin. I am the person he chose to share his life with, and the person he trusted to preserve his memory." "Absolutely, Mrs. Moore. And that's exactly why I'm calling you directly with this news. The President's office has been very clear that the Medal of Freedom will be presented to you as Brian's widow, with full recognition of your status as his surviving spouse. The ceremony will honor not just Brian's heroism, but the partnership that gave him the strength to make such a sacrifice." I thought of Maria Santos's words about Brian, saying that love meant protecting people, even when it cost everything. Our marriage hadn't weakened. Hemet had given him the emotional foundation to be heroic when heroism was needed. "Mrs. Moore, there's something else. The President would like to meet with you privately before the ceremony to discuss Brian's service and his impact on the space program. You'll be introduced as Mrs. Hero, Astronaut, the widow of the man who exemplified the courage and dedication that make America's space program possible." Mrs. Hero, Astronaut. The title felt surreal, but also profoundly right. Brian had died doing what he'd trained his entire career to do, protecting his colleagues and advancing human knowledge. That I would be recognized as his partner in that mission felt like justice finally being served. The ceremony is scheduled for October 15th, exactly 1 year after your husband's death. We felt the timing was appropriate for both remembrance and celebration of his legacy. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen surrounded by the life Brian and I had built together, finally understanding that everything was about to change. For months, Margaret and her family had tried to erase me from Brian's story, to reduce our marriage to a footnote in his biography. Now the President of the United States would be honoring me as the widow of a national hero. I called Janet Collins first, sharing the news that would demolish any remaining legal challenges to my status as Brian's wife. Then I called Tom Rodriguez, who whooped with joy when I told him about the Medal of Freedom. "Geraldine, this is what Brian deserved from the beginning. I'm so glad someone finally had the courage to tell the truth about what he did." But the call I was most anticipating was the one I wouldn't make. I would wait for Margaret to learn about the ceremony through news reports, the way I'd been forced to learn about so many family decisions over the years. She would discover that while she'd been fighting to exclude me from Brian's memorial, NASA had been preparing to honor me as his widow at the White House. The irony was perfect and painful. Margaret had spent months arguing that I wasn't really family, that Brian's marriage to me was somehow illegitimate or temporary. Now the President would be presenting me with the nation's highest civilian honor as Brian's surviving spouse, in front of cameras that would broadcast our story to the world. As I prepared for bed that night, I thought about Brian's journal entry, where he'd written that I'd made him brave enough for heroism. Tomorrow, the world would learn that he'd made me brave enough to fight for the truth about our love, even when that fight seemed impossible to win. The woman Margaret had dismissed as just the old woman who trapped him was about to become the officially recognized widow of an American hero. Brian's secret letter was hidden in the back of his desk drawer, sealed in an envelope marked for Geraldine, to be opened only if my family causes problems. I found it while looking for our insurance documents, preparing for the White House ceremony that would validate everything he'd tried to protect me from. The envelope was thick, containing multiple pages in Brian's careful handwriting. As I read, I realized he'd written it 18 months before his death, during one of his family's particularly cruel campaigns against our marriage. "My dearest Geraldine," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means I'm gone and my family is behaving exactly as I feared they would. I'm writing this because I know them better than you do, and I know they'll try to destroy you after my death to justify their treatment of you during my life." Page after page revealed Brian's strategic thinking about protecting me from his family's inevitable attacks. He'd anticipated Margaret's legal challenges, David's intimidation tactics, even their attempts to rewrite our marriage as some kind of manipulation or mistake. "Margaret will claim I was mentally compromised during our marriage. She hired lawyers and experts and tried to paint you as a gold digger who took advantage of my loneliness. This is projection. Margaret can't imagine love without calculation, because she's never experienced it herself." Brian had documented specific incidents I'd forgotten or dismissed. Moments when his family's hostility had been subtle but deliberate. The Christmas invitation that excluded me, the family photos that always positioned me outside the group, the conversations that stopped when I approached. He'd been cataloging their behavior as evidence for exactly this scenario. "You're too kind to see their cruelty for what it is, but I see it clearly. They're threatened by our happiness because it exposes the emptiness of their own relationships. Margaret's marriage is a business arrangement. David's divorce was acrimonious because he couldn't understand why his wife wasn't satisfied with financial security. They can't comprehend what we have." The letter contained practical advice that proved Brian had been planning for this battle long before his death. He'd positioned assets to be difficult for them to challenge, created documentation trails that would support my legal standing, even prepared testimony from colleagues who could attest to his mental state during our marriage. If they challenge the will, show them the recordings I made of our anniversary conversations. If they claim I was isolated, introduce them to Alina and Tom and the dozen other colleagues who celebrated our relationship. If they suggest you manipulated me, remind them that I chose you over their approval repeatedly and explicitly. But the most powerful section dealt with his understanding of institutional cowardice, both within his family and at NASA. "Geraldine, you'll face pressure from people who want you to be quiet, to accept small compromises, to avoid making waves. My family will offer you money to disappear. NASA administrators might suggest that private recognition is more appropriate than public honor. These people prioritize their comfort over truth." Brian had seen the connections between his family's behavior and the institutional forces that would try to minimize his heroism. Both represented the same impulse, protecting comfortable narratives rather than acknowledging difficult truths. "Don't let them make my sacrifice convenient for their politics." I didn't stay in that chamber to save them bureaucratic embarrassment. I stayed because protecting people is more important than protecting institutions. Honor that choice by refusing to let anyone diminish it. The letter included specific instructions for dealing with NASA's bureaucracy, contacts within the agency who could be trusted, even suggested language for advocating for proper recognition. Brian had essentially written me a manual for fighting battles I hadn't known I'd need to fight. "You made me brave enough to stand up to my family when they tried to control my choices. Now I need you to be brave enough to stand up to everyone who tries to control my legacy. Don't let them reduce our love to a footnote or my heroism to a cover-up." Reading Brian's words, I understood that everything happening now, Margaret's legal challenges, NASA's initial reluctance to honor him publicly, the attempts to marginalize me as his widow, had been anticipated and prepared for by a man who'd spent 5 years learning to protect what he loved. The final page contained the most personal message, and reading it made me cry with both grief and determination. "Geraldine, if you're reading this, I want you to know that our marriage was the best decision I ever made. You didn't trap me, or manipulate me, or take advantage of me. You loved me completely and taught me what real partnership looked like. Fight for that truth, not because you need to prove anything to them, but because the world needs to know that love like ours exists. I folded the letter carefully, understanding that Brian had given me more than legal ammunition. He'd given me a roadmap for honoring our relationship and his sacrifice. The White House ceremony would be my opportunity to validate every choice he'd made, every boundary he'd set, every act of love he'd shown me despite his family's disapproval. Margaret had spent months trying to erase me from Brian's story, but Brian himself had written the ending to that story, and in his version, I wasn't a footnote or a mistake or a temporary inconvenience. I was his partner, his choice, his widow, and his legacy. Tomorrow, I would begin preparing for a ceremony that would prove Brian's judgment had been perfect about his family's character, about institutional cowardice, and about the love that had made him brave enough to save lives. The Presidential Medal of Freedom felt impossibly heavy in my hands as president. Martinez placed it around my neck in the East Room of the White House. The weight wasn't from the medal itself, a beautiful gold star suspended from a blue ribbon, but from the knowledge that it represented Brian's ultimate sacrifice and our love's final vindication. Mrs. Geraldine Moore, the president said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room, filled with NASA officials, space program dignitaries, and invited guests, accepts this Medal of Freedom on behalf of her husband, Brian Moore, whose heroic actions saved 200 lives and prevented one of the greatest disasters in aerospace history. I stood in that historic room, wearing the navy dress I'd chosen because Brian had always said it brought out my eyes, and felt the weight of 6 months of grief, legal battles, and family cruelty lifting from my shoulders. Behind me sat Tom Rodriguez, Dr. Elena Vasquez, Maria Santos, and dozens of Brian's colleagues who'd fought to ensure this moment would happen. Notably absent were Margaret, David, and the rest of Brian's birth family. They'd received invitations, protocol demanded it, but had declined to attend what Margaret's lawyer had called an inappropriate politicization of a family tragedy. The president continued, reading from remarks that had been carefully crafted to tell the complete story of Brian's heroism. Brian Moore faced an impossible choice in the final moments of his life: save himself or save his colleagues and the hundreds of people working in surrounding buildings. His decision to remain at his post, manually controlling systems that had failed, exemplifies the courage and selflessness that define American heroism. The ceremony was being broadcast live on major networks, ensuring that Brian's true story would reach millions of people who'd never heard about the NASA engineer who'd died saving lives. More importantly, it was being reported by journalists who'd been briefed on the family dynamics, who understood the significance of honoring me as Brian's widow, despite his family's attempts to exclude me. During the private meeting before the ceremony, President Martinez had spoken with me about Brian's service and the importance of recognizing sacrifice honestly. Mrs. Moore, your husband's heroism deserves public acknowledgement, but so does your fight to preserve his memory against those who would diminish it. You've shown remarkable courage in defending the truth. I'd shared some of Brian's letter with her, explaining how he'd anticipated institutional resistance to recognizing his sacrifice. The president's response had been immediate and firm. Mr. Moore understood that protecting truth requires courage from institutions, not just individuals. Today, we choose courage. The medal ceremony included a video presentation featuring Brian's colleagues describing his final moments, the technical details of his life-saving actions, and the broader implications of his sacrifice. Maria Santos spoke on camera about Brian's calmness under pressure and his determination to protect others. Tom Rodriguez explained the engineering challenges Brian had overcome manually in those final minutes. But the most powerful moment came when Director Hawkins presented the technical analysis showing exactly how many lives Brian had saved. The explosion, if uncontained, would have spread through 6 buildings, potentially killing or injuring nearly 400 people. Brian's actions had reduced that catastrophe to 3 deaths, including his own. The mathematics of heroism are stark, Director Hawkins explained to the assembled audience. Brian Moore traded his life for the lives of hundreds of others. This wasn't accidentally, it was a conscious choice made by a man who understood the consequences and chose service over survival. After the formal ceremony, guests approached me with condolences, congratulations, and stories about Brian I'd never heard. a retired astronaut, told me how Brian's safety innovations had influenced spacecraft design for a decade. A young engineer explained how Brian's mentorship had shaped her career. The administrator of NASA mentioned plans to name the new lunar research facility after Brian. The media attention was overwhelming but welcome. Reporters wanted to know about our marriage, our life together, the legal challenges I'd faced from his family. I spoke honestly about the love Brian and I had shared and the attempts to minimize both our relationship and his heroism. Brian chose me as his wife. I told a journalist from the Washington Post, he chose to love me despite his family's disapproval. And in his final moments, he chose to save lives rather than save himself. Those choices define who he was, and no amount of legal maneuvering or social pressure can change that. The story that emerged from the ceremony was exactly what Brian would have wanted: recognition for his heroism, validation of our marriage, and exposure of the institutional forces that had tried to minimize both. The headlines read, "Hero Astronauts, Widow Honored Despite Family Opposition, and NASA Engineer's Sacrifice Saves Hundreds." Family disputes continue. That evening, back in my hotel room, I called Mrs. Patterson to share details about the ceremony. Her excitement was infectious, and her pride in my perseverance was deeply moving. "Geraldine, Brian would be so proud of you today. You fought for the truth about his heroism in your marriage, and you won." As I prepared for bed, I thought about the medal resting in its presentation box on the hotel dresser. Tomorrow, it would come home with me to the house Brian and I had shared, where it would remind me daily that love and heroism aren't diminished by those who choose not to recognize them. The ceremony had been more than recognition, it had been vindication of every choice Brian had made, including his choice to love me. Margaret's public apology letter arrived by certified mail 3 days after the White House ceremony, typed on expensive letterhead and carefully worded by lawyers who understood that their client's reputation was now in free fall. The letter felt hollow in my hands, each precisely crafted sentence designed to minimize damage rather than express genuine remorse. "Dear Mrs. Moore," it began, "in light of recent events and new information about Brian's heroic actions, I realize that my family's response to his death may have caused you additional pain during an already difficult time, may have caused additional pain, as if excluding me from his memorial service, challenging his will, and sending anonymous threats were minor social missteps, rather than a coordinated campaign of cruelty." The letter continued with the same careful language. "We now understand that Brian's sacrifice was even greater than we initially realized, and we respect the recognition he has received from NASA and the President. We hope that moving forward, we can honor Brian's memory in ways that acknowledge the full scope of his service and the importance of his personal relationships." Personal relationships. Even in her apology, Margaret couldn't bring herself to use the word marriage or acknowledge me as Brian's wife directly. But the letter's final paragraph revealed the real motivation behind this sudden change of heart. "Given the public nature of recent events, we believe it would be beneficial for all parties to present a united family front in honoring Brian's legacy. We hope you will consider joining us for a private memorial service, where we can pay appropriate respects to Brian's memory and his heroic sacrifice." A united family front. Margaret had spent months trying to exclude me from Brian's story, but now that the President had honored me as his widow on national television, she needed to be seen as reconciled with me to salvage her own reputation. I called Janet Collins to discuss the letter. Her laughter was sharp and humorless. "Geraldine, this isn't an apology, it's damage control. Margaret watched you receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom on live television and realized that her public campaign against you has made her look petty and cruel." The news coverage following the ceremony had been devastating for Margaret's reputation. Social media was filled with commentary about the family that had tried to exclude a grieving widow from her husband's recognition. Editorial writers had used Margaret's behavior as an example of how family prejudices could overshadow genuine heroism. But the most damaging coverage came from investigative reporters who dug into the legal challenges to Brian's will. Details about the anonymous threats, the financial pressure tactics, and the attempts to paint me as a gold digger had made national news. Margaret, who'd spent her life carefully curating her image as a respectable family matriarch, was now publicly known as the woman who'd tormented her brother's widow. The confrontation I'd been avoiding finally came when Margaret appeared at my door on a Thursday evening, her usual commanding presence diminished by the weight of public humiliation. She looked older than her 65 years, her perfectly styled exterior showing cracks I'd never seen before. "Geraldine, we need to talk." I invited her into the living room, where Brian and I had spent countless quiet evenings, the space now dominated by the Presidential Medal of Freedom, displayed in its place of honor on the mantel. Margaret's eyes went immediately to the medal, her face tightening with emotions I couldn't read. When she spoke, her voice carried none of its usual authority. "I underestimated you," she said simply. "I underestimated your marriage to Brian, and I underestimated his feelings for you." "You underestimated Brian," I replied. "You thought he was weak enough to be manipulated, when actually he was strong enough to choose love over family approval." Margaret winced. "You're right. I thought I convinced myself that your marriage was temporary, that Brian was going through some kind of crisis. I couldn't accept that he'd found something with you that he'd never had with us." For the first time since I'd known her, Margaret looked genuinely vulnerable. "Watching you at that ceremony, seeing the president honor you as Brian's widow, seeing his colleagues speak about your marriage with such respect, I realized I'd been fighting against something real and beautiful out of my own fear and prejudice." "What were you afraid of?" "That Brian had moved beyond us, that you'd given him something we never could, that maybe we weren't the family he needed." She paused, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easily. "I was afraid that if I admitted your marriage was real and loving, I'd have to admit that our relationships with Brian had been inadequate." The confession hung in the air between us. I thought of Brian's journal entries about his family's emotional limitations, his frustration with their inability to express genuine affection, his gratitude for finding unconditional love with me. "Margaret, Brian never stopped loving his family, but he needed more than you were able to give him. That wasn't your fault, but fighting against his happiness was." She nodded, tears threatening her carefully maintained composure. "The legal challenge, the pressure tactics, I convinced myself I was protecting Brian's legacy. Really, I was protecting my own pride." "And what about now?" Margaret reached into her purse and withdrew a folded document. "This formally withdraws all legal challenges to Brian's will. The estate is yours, completely and without restriction. I've also instructed our attorneys to issue a public statement acknowledging our error and supporting your status as Brian's widow." The document was comprehensive. Not just ending the legal battle, but acknowledging my rights as Brian's spouse and expressing regret for the family's behavior. It would be expensive for Margaret, not just financially, but socially, as it amounted to a public admission that she'd been wrong about everything. "Why now?" I asked. "Because Brian was right about you, and I was wrong. Because watching you fight for his memory and your marriage showed me the kind of courage he fell in love with. And because I'm tired of being the villain in my brother's love story." Margaret's apology felt genuine in a way her letter hadn't, but it couldn't undo months of cruelty or restore the relationship that might have been possible if she'd chosen acceptance over opposition from the beginning. "I can't give you back the memorial service where you should have been honored as his wife," Margaret continued, "but I can stop making your grief harder than it already is." The NASA memorial plaque was unveiled on a crisp November morning, exactly 13 months after Brian's death, carved in black granite and mounted in the main lobby of the Johnson Space Center. It bore the simple inscription, "Brian Moore, hero engineer. His sacrifice saved lives and advanced human understanding of the cosmos." Survived by his loving wife, Geraldine Moore. Standing before that plaque, surrounded by Brian's colleagues and friends, I felt a peace I hadn't known since the day he died. The official recognition was important, but more meaningful was the phrase "survived by his loving wife," words that validated our marriage and my status as his widow for everyone who entered this building. Director Hawkins spoke at the dedication ceremony, her words carrying the authority of institutional acknowledgement that had been so long in coming. "Brian Moore represents the best of NASA's mission, the willingness to sacrifice for the advancement of human knowledge and the protection of colleagues. His widow, Geraldine, has shown the same courage in ensuring that his heroism receives the recognition it deserves." The transformation in my life since the White House ceremony had been profound. I'd gone from being an isolated widow fighting for basic recognition to becoming an advocate for military and aerospace families facing similar challenges. The Brian Moore Foundation, established with part of his estate, was already helping other families navigate the bureaucratic complexities that follow a service member's death. My first speaking engagement had been at a NASA Family Support Conference, where I'd shared Brian's story and the importance of institutional support for surviving spouses. The response had been overwhelming. Dozens of families reached out with their own stories of battles for recognition, struggles with bureaucracy, and fights against those who would minimize their loved one's service. What you did matters beyond just your situation, Dr. Alina Vasquez had told me after that first speech. You showed that it's possible to fight institutional indifference and win. That gives hope to other families facing similar challenges. The foundation work had introduced me to a community I'd never known existed: military widows, aerospace families, people who understood both the pride of being connected to heroic service and the unique challenges that came with that connection. Through them, I'd found purpose beyond my personal grief. Margaret had surprised me by becoming an unexpected ally in this work. Her public reversal had been complete. She'd not only acknowledged her mistakes, but had contributed significantly to the foundation and used her social connections to raise awareness about family support issues. "I can't undo what I did to you," she'd told me during one of our monthly coffee meetings that had evolved from awkward obligation to genuine connection. "But I can try to prevent other families from making the same mistakes we made." Our relationship would never be close to much pain lay between us for that. But it had evolved into something respectful and occasionally warm. Margaret had learned to speak about Brian's marriage with genuine appreciation, and I'd learned to see her actions as stemming from fear rather than malice. The most meaningful change, though, was in how I thought about my own life. For months after Brian's death, I'd felt like my story had ended with his, that I was simply the keeper of his memory, waiting out my remaining years. The fight for his recognition had awakened something in me that I'd thought was gone forever, a sense of purpose and the energy to pursue it. "Brian would be amazed by what you've become," Tom Rodriguez had said at the memorial plaque dedication. "He fell in love with a quietly strong woman, but you've become a force for change. He'd be so proud." I'd started writing about our experience, just Brian's heroism, but the institutional resistance to recognizing it, the family dynamics that had complicated my grief, and the importance of fighting for truth even when that fight seemed impossible. The book was tentatively titled Love and Heroism: Fighting for Truth in the Face of Institutional Cowardice. The writing process had been therapeutic, helping me understand not just what had happened but why it mattered. Brian's story wasn't unique. He was one of many heroes whose sacrifices had been minimized for bureaucratic convenience. My story wasn't unique either. I was one of many family members who'd had to fight for recognition of their loved ones' service, but together, our stories represented something important about the choice between comfort and truth, between protecting institutions and protecting individuals, between maintaining pleasant fictions and acknowledging difficult realities. The garden Brian and I had planted together was thriving in its second season. I'd expanded it, adding a section dedicated to plants that attracted butterflies, something Brian had always meant to do but never found time for. Working in that soil, tending plants we'd chosen together, felt like continuing a conversation that death had interrupted but not ended. Mrs. Patterson still brought me casseroles sometimes, though now it was more about friendship than charity. She'd become the foundation's first volunteer, using her natural nosiness to help other families navigate complex support systems. "You've found your way back to life," she observed one afternoon, as we worked in the butterfly garden together. "Different than before, but life nonetheless." She was right. I was different than I'd been when Brian was alive, different than I'd been in those first horrible months after his death. I was stronger, more purpose-driven, more aware of my own capacity for endurance and growth. The Presidential Medal sat in a place of honor in my living room, but it wasn't a monument to the past. It was a reminder of what was possible when people chose courage over convenience, truth over comfort, love over fear. Brian's flight badge rests against my chest as I write these final words, the small NASA insignia he wore for 23 years, now serving as my daily reminder of love that transcends death and heroism that survives institutional indifference. I wear it not as borrowed glory, but as a symbol of partnership that made both of us stronger than we could have been alone. 18 months have passed since that devastating memorial service where I sat alone in the back row, excluded from the family section by people who couldn't see past their own prejudices. Today, I'm preparing for the annual Brian Moore Memorial Lecture at NASA, an event that brings together aerospace professionals to discuss both technical innovation and the human courage that makes exploration possible. The transformation has been complete and profound. Where once I fought simply for the right to be recognized as Brian's widow, I now advocate for systemic changes in how institutions support families of fallen heroes. The foundation has helped over 200 families navigate similar challenges, and the memoir I'm finishing has become a platform for discussing institutional accountability and family dynamics in times of crisis. Margaret sits on the foundation's board now, her experience with our family's failures making her a surprisingly effective advocate for better communication and support systems. Our relationship will never be what it might have been if she'd chosen acceptance over opposition from the beginning. But it has evolved into something meaningful, a collaboration built on shared regret and mutual determination to prevent other families from experiencing what we did. "I can't change what we put you through," she told me at our last board meeting. "But I can spend whatever time I have left making sure other families don't face the same isolation." Brian's NASA colleagues have become more than professional supporters. They've become family in the truest sense. People who celebrate anniversaries of our marriage, who share memories that keep Brian alive in our conversations, who understand that honoring his memory means respecting the choices he made, including his choice to love me. The most unexpected blessing has been the community of aerospace families I've discovered through this work. People who understand the unique challenges of loving someone whose job involves calculated risks, who appreciate both the pride and the fear that come with being connected to exploration and discovery, who know that heroism is often quiet and unrecognized until crisis demands everything. Through them, I've learned that my story isn't unique, that many families have fought similar battles for recognition, respect, and basic acknowledgement of their loved one's service. But I've also learned that individual battles can create broader change when they're fought with determination and truth. The book will be published next month, and early reviews suggest it might reach audiences beyond aerospace families. Publishers think it speaks to broader themes about standing up to institutional power, fighting for truth in the face of comfortable lies, and finding strength in the face of systematic attempts to diminish your worth. "You've turned your grief into a force for justice," the editor told me. "Brian's heroism saved lives in that moment, but your advocacy is saving families from ongoing harm." The garden has become a sanctuary where I feel closest to Brian's continuing presence. The butterfly section he'd always planned to add is now thriving, attracting monarchs and swallowtails that dance among the flowers we chose together. Working in that soil, I often find myself talking to him about the day's challenges, the foundation's progress, the ways his love continues to guide my choices. Sometimes I imagine what he'd think of the woman I've become since his death. The quiet widow he married has evolved into someone willing to take on institutions, to speak publicly about painful truths, to fight for changes that benefit people she never meet. I think he'd be surprised by some of it, but not by the underlying determination. He'd recognize the strength he'd seen in me from the beginning. Strength I hadn't known I possessed until I needed it. The Presidential Medal of Freedom hangs in my living room now, not as a monument to loss, but as a reminder of what's possible when people choose courage over comfort. Visitors often ask about it, and I tell them Brian's story, not just about his final heroic moments, but about the love that gave him the emotional foundation to make such a sacrifice. "Real love makes you brave," I tell them. "It gives you something worth protecting, something worth sacrificing for, something worth fighting for, even after death." The NASA memorial plaque will outlast me, ensuring that future generations of engineers and astronauts will know about Brian Moore and the sacrifice he made for his colleagues. But more importantly, they'll know he was survived by his loving wife, Geraldine Moore. Words that validate not just our marriage but the possibility that love can triumph over institutional indifference and family prejudice. As I prepare for bed each night, I still talk to Brian about the day's events, still feel his presence in the life we built together, still draw strength from the love that made both of us braver than we might have been alone. Death ended our physical partnership, but it couldn't diminish the emotional foundation that continues to guide my choices. Tomorrow I'll wake up as the widow of a hero, the president of a foundation that serves aerospace families, the author of a book about institutional courage and personal transformation. But tonight, I'm simply Geraldine Moore, a woman who was lucky enough to find extraordinary love late in life and brave enough to fight for its recognition when fighting seemed impossible. Brian taught me that heroism isn't about seeking gold, about doing what's right when doing what's right costs everything. In the months since his death, I've learned that lesson applies not just to split-second decisions in crisis moments, but to the daily choice to protect truth against those who would prefer comfortable lies. If you've ever felt excluded from grief that was rightfully yours, if you've ever had to fight for recognition of love that others chose not to see, if you've ever faced institutional indifference to personal truth, know that the fight is worth it, that love is stronger than prejudice, and that heroes are remembered not just for how they died, but for how they chose to live and love. I hope you enjoyed this story.